Daniel Parker told Marcus he just needed a quiet weekend away. That was the simplest way to explain it, even if it wasn't the whole truth. For 4 years, Daniel and Marcus Reed had built a life together in the city. Their apartment was comfortable, their routines predictable, and from the outside their relationship looked stable. Friends often described them as solid. But stability had slowly turned into silence. The conversations that once lasted for hours now ended after a few sentences. Marcus worked long shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted, while Daniel spent most evenings alone with his thoughts. Daniel couldn't remember exactly when the distance started growing between them. It had been gradual, almost invisible, like a quiet crack spreading across glass. At first he ignored it, convincing himself that long relationships simply changed over time. But the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore the loneliness that settled in his chest. That loneliness was the real reason Daniel had driven 3 hours away from the city. The mountain village where he arrived that morning was small and quiet, surrounded by thick forests that stretched across the hills. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and damp soil. It was the kind of place where the noise of the world felt far away. Daniel parked his car near a narrow trailhead and began walking into the forest. At first, the path was wide and clear, marked by old wooden signs and scattered stones. Sunlight filtered through the tall trees above, breaking into soft patterns across the ground. The deeper Daniel walked, the quieter everything became. The distant hum of cars disappeared, replaced by rustling leaves and the occasional call of birds hidden high in the branches. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt his shoulders begin to relax. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't thinking about unfinished work or unanswered messages. Most importantly, he wasn't thinking about the awkward silence that often filled the apartment he shared with Marcus. Instead, Daniel focused on the steady rhythm of his footsteps along the dirt trail. He had told himself this trip was simply about getting fresh air and clearing his mind. But the truth was more complicated. Daniel needed space to understand why being in a relationship still felt so lonely. After nearly an hour of walking, the trail narrowed and curved deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker, their trunks tall and unmoving like silent guardians. The ground sloped gently downward until the path finally opened into a wide meadow surrounded by forest on every side. Daniel stopped at the edge of the clearing. The meadow was beautiful in a quiet, untouched way. Tall grass swayed softly in the breeze, glowing gold under the afternoon sun. A small stream cut across one side of the field, its water moving slowly over smooth stones. For a moment, Daniel believed he had found exactly what he had been looking for, complete solitude. Then he heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. A soft clinking noise carried through the air, irregular but steady. Daniel tilted his head, listening carefully. The sound repeated again, clearer this time. Bells. Curious, Daniel stepped farther into the meadow, scanning the tall grass ahead. A few seconds later, movement caught his attention. White shapes shifted slowly near the far side of the field. Sheep. A small flock grazed peacefully along the edge of the meadow, their bells producing the quiet sound Daniel had heard. They moved slowly, heads down, completely undisturbed by the world around them. Daniel smiled faintly, surprised to find livestock so deep in the forest. Then he noticed someone standing nearby. At first, the man blended into the shade of a large oak tree, leaning casually against its trunk. He wore worn boots and a dark shirt with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. One hand rested loosely in his pocket while the other held a long wooden staff. The man was watching the sheep with calm patience, as if he had been standing there for hours. When Daniel stepped closer, the man finally turned his head. Their eyes met across the meadow. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel felt a strange sense of being observed, not in an uncomfortable way, but in a way that made him suddenly aware of himself. The man pushed away from the tree and walked a few steps forward. "You're a long way from the main trail," he said, his voice relaxed but curious. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, slightly embarrassed. "Yeah, I guess I wandered farther than I planned." The man studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. "Most people don't come out this far," he said. "Name's Ethan." "Daniel," he replied. Ethan nodded toward the meadow behind him where the sheep continued grazing peacefully. "I watch 'em out here most days," Ethan explained. "It's quiet, not many interruptions." Daniel glanced around the open field again, realizing just how isolated the place truly was. Quiet wasn't the only thing he felt out here. There was also a strange sense of clarity. Daniel took a slow breath, preparing to head back toward the trail before it grew too late. He had already stayed longer than he expected. But just as he turned slightly to leave, Ethan spoke again. "You know," Ethan said calmly, studying him with thoughtful eyes, "you don't look like someone who came all the way out here just to take a walk." Daniel paused. Something in Ethan's voice suggested he had already noticed the truth Daniel himself was still trying to understand. And suddenly, the quiet forest didn't feel quite as empty as Daniel had first believed. Daniel Parker told himself he would not go back to the meadow. The encounter with Ethan had been unexpected, and Daniel assumed it would remain nothing more than a brief moment during a solitary walk in the forest. When he returned to the small guest house in the village that evening, he tried to settle into a quiet routine. He showered, ate a simple dinner, and scrolled through his phone. Marcus Reed had sent a short message earlier. "Hope the trip is relaxing." Daniel stared at the text longer than necessary before replying. "Yeah, it's peaceful here." The response felt incomplete, but Daniel sent it anyway. Marcus answered with a thumbs-up emoji a few minutes later, and the conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. Daniel placed the phone on the bedside table and leaned back against the pillow. The silence in the room felt strangely familiar. It reminded him of the quiet that often filled the apartment he shared with Marcus, where both of them existed in the same space without truly connecting. He closed his eyes, but instead of sleep, his thoughts drifted back to the meadow. More specifically, to Ethan. There had been something unusual about the shepherd's calm presence. Ethan had spoken very little, yet his simple observation lingered in Daniel's mind. "You don't look like someone who came all the way out here just to take a walk." Daniel wasn't sure why the comment bothered him. Perhaps because Ethan had been right. The next morning, Daniel woke earlier than expected. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the guesthouse room, casting pale streaks across the wooden floor. He stretched slowly, listening to the distant sounds of the quiet village beginning its day. For several minutes, Daniel debated what to do. There were other trails around the mountains. The receptionist had even recommended a scenic route that led to a waterfall farther north. But without thinking too hard about it, Daniel found himself pulling on his hiking boots and heading back toward the same forest path. The walk felt shorter this time. Daniel moved through the trail with more familiarity, recognizing the curve of the path and the towering pine trees that lined it. The forest air remained cool and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth. Soon the trail opened again into the wide meadow. Daniel slowed his pace as he approached the clearing. The sheep were there, scattered across the grass exactly as they had been the day before. Their bells chimed softly as they grazed, creating the same peaceful rhythm that had first drawn his attention. Ethan stood near the edge of the field, adjusting a wooden fence post. When he noticed Daniel stepping out from the trees, he straightened and gave a small nod of recognition. "Back again," Ethan said. Daniel felt slightly self-conscious but smiled. "I guess I liked the walk." Ethan studied him for a moment, the hint of amusement visible in his eyes. "Or maybe you just liked the view," he replied, gesturing lightly toward the open meadow. Daniel laughed quietly and stepped farther into the clearing. "Can't argue with that." For a while, neither of them spoke much. Ethan returned to checking the fence while Daniel stood nearby, watching the sheep move slowly across the tall grass. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt strangely easy. Eventually, Ethan walked back over and rested his staff against the tree. "So," Ethan said, folding his arms casually, "what brings someone like you this far from the city?" Daniel hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer felt complicated. "I just needed a break," Daniel said finally. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the response. "A break from work?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not exactly." Ethan didn't press him immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the sheep, giving Daniel the space to continue if he wanted. After a moment, Daniel sighed quietly. "Have you ever been around people every day," he said slowly, "but still feel completely alone?" Ethan looked back at him with steady attention. "I think everyone feels that sometimes," Ethan replied. Daniel kicked lightly at a small stone in the grass. "Marcus and I have been together for 4 years, he explained. "Lately it just feels different." Ethan didn't interrupt. "We don't fight," Daniel continued. "Nothing dramatic like that. It's just quiet all the time. Like we're slowly drifting into separate lives without realizing it." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes silence says more than arguments, he said. Daniel glanced up, surprised by the accuracy of the comment. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt like someone was actually listening to him without distraction. The two of them eventually sat near the base of the large oak tree overlooking the meadow. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the grass while the sheep continued grazing peacefully. Their conversation shifted naturally between small details about the forest and occasional pieces of Daniel's life in the city. Ethan spoke about living nearby in a small cabin and spending most of his days outdoors with the flock. Daniel found the simplicity of Ethan's lifestyle strangely appealing. There was a calm confidence in the way Ethan spoke, as if he had already found the balance Daniel had been searching for. Time passed almost unnoticed. When the sun began lowering toward the treetops, Daniel realized he should probably return to the village before dark. He stood slowly, brushing the grass from his jeans. I should head back, Daniel said. Ethan rose as well, leaning once again against the tree. Probably a good idea, Ethan replied. Daniel hesitated for a moment, unsure why he felt reluctant to leave. Then Ethan stepped closer and placed a brief hand on Daniel's shoulder. The gesture was simple and friendly, but Daniel felt a sudden warmth spread through his chest. You seem happier out here, Ethan said quietly. Daniel met his gaze. For a moment, neither of them moved. And as Daniel finally turned toward the trail leading back into the forest, one thought lingered clearly in his mind. He already knew he was going to come back again. Daniel Parker spent most of the next morning trying to convince himself that he shouldn't return to the meadow. The guesthouse room felt smaller than it had the day before. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the quiet space, yet Daniel felt restless. He paced between the bed and the small desk, picking up his phone and putting it down again without purpose. Marcus Reed had sent another message earlier that morning. Everything good there? Daniel typed a reply, erased it, and then typed again. Yeah, just doing some hiking. Marcus responded almost immediately. Good. Enjoy the break. That was it. No questions. No curiosity about where Daniel had gone or what he had been doing. The conversation ended in less than a minute, leaving Daniel staring at the screen with a familiar emptiness settling in his chest. He slipped the phone into his pocket and exhaled slowly. The truth was becoming difficult to ignore. Daniel wasn't thinking about the forest because of the trails or the scenery. He was thinking about Ethan. The shepherd's calm voice, his steady attention, the way their conversations flowed without effort, all of it lingered in Daniel's mind. The thought of returning both excited and unsettled him. But by midday, the decision had already been made. Daniel followed the same path through the forest, moving with a quiet urgency he didn't bother trying to explain to himself. The sound of wind through the trees and the crunch of dirt beneath his boots accompanied him as he walked. When the trail finally opened into the meadow, Daniel slowed slightly. Ethan was already there. The sheep grazed peacefully across the tall grass while Ethan crouched beside a small stone fire pit near the oak tree. A thin curl of smoke drifted upward as he adjusted a few pieces of wood. Ethan glanced up as Daniel approached, and a small, knowing smile appeared on his face. I was wondering if you'd show up again, Ethan said. Daniel tried to sound casual. Just another walk. Ethan stood, brushing his hands together. Of course, he replied, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. Daniel sat down on the grass near the tree, watching the sheep wander slowly across the meadow. The quiet atmosphere felt familiar now, almost comforting. Ethan joined him, settling onto the ground a short distance away. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it carried the gentle sounds of wind moving through the tall grass and the occasional clink of the sheep's bells. Finally, Ethan broke the quiet. You seem distracted today, he observed. Daniel gave a faint laugh. Is it that obvious? Ethan shrugged slightly. Only if someone's paying attention. Daniel rested his elbows on his knees and stared out across the meadow. I keep thinking about my life back home, he admitted. Ethan waited patiently. Marcus and I used to talk about everything, Daniel continued. Plans, dreams, stupid little things that didn't matter. Somewhere along the way, all of that just stopped. He paused, searching for the right words. It's like we're roommates now, Daniel said quietly. Two people sharing the same space but living completely separate lives. Ethan studied him thoughtfully. That kind of loneliness can sneak up on people, Ethan said. Daniel nodded. I stayed because I thought things would eventually change, he admitted. But lately I'm starting to think maybe they won't. Quote, a small breeze moved through the meadow, bending the tall grass around them. Ethan reached for a small stick near the fire pit and gently pushed the embers, sending a few sparks floating briefly into the air. Why do you keep coming back here? Ethan asked calmly. Daniel hesitated. The question lingered between them longer than he expected. He could have answered in a dozen safe ways. He could have said he liked the quiet or the scenery. But instead, Daniel looked directly at Ethan. Because when I talk to you, he said slowly, I feel like someone actually hears me. Ethan didn't respond immediately. His expression softened slightly, and he shifted closer on the grass until the distance between them felt noticeably smaller. You deserve that, Ethan said. Daniel felt a strange warmth spread through him at the simple statement. For years, he had accepted emotional distance as something unavoidable in a long relationship. Hearing someone acknowledge his loneliness so directly made the feeling impossible to ignore. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden light across the meadow. Without thinking, Daniel turned slightly toward Ethan. Their shoulders brushed. Neither of them moved away. Daniel felt his heart begin to beat faster as the quiet moment stretched between them. He knew the situation had crossed into dangerous territory. Marcus was still part of his life, still waiting for him back in the city. Yet the connection Daniel felt sitting beside Ethan was undeniable. Ethan turned his head slightly, their faces now only inches apart. You're thinking too much, Ethan said softly. Daniel exhaled. Probably. For a brief moment, Daniel considered standing up and walking away. That would have been the sensible choice. It would have protected the fragile structure of the life he had built with Marcus. But instead, he stayed. Ethan slowly reached out and placed his hand lightly over Daniel's. The contact was warm and steady. Daniel looked down at their hands, fully aware of what it meant. He had already crossed the emotional line days ago. Ethan lifted his gaze to meet Daniel's. Neither of them spoke. Then, gently and without hesitation, Ethan leaned closer. Daniel closed the remaining distance. The kiss was quiet, brief, and filled with a kind of honesty Daniel hadn't felt in years. When they pulled apart, the meadow seemed impossibly still. Daniel sat there for a moment, his thoughts racing. He knew exactly what had just happened. And as he walked back toward the forest path later that evening, one question echoed relentlessly in his mind. Had he just betrayed the life he built with Marcus? Or had he finally admitted the truth about it? Daniel Parker barely noticed the forest around him as he walked back toward the village. The trail that had once felt peaceful now carried a different weight. His mind replayed the moment in the meadow again and again, the quiet fire, Ethan's steady gaze, and the brief kiss that had changed everything. It hadn't been reckless or rushed. If anything, it had felt inevitable. That realization unsettled Daniel more than anything else. By the time he reached the guest house, the sky had darkened into deep shades of blue. The small building was quiet, the hallway lights dim and warm. Daniel unlocked his room and stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a slow breath. For several seconds he simply stood there. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Daniel pulled it out and saw Marcus Reed's name glowing on the screen. Did you have a good day? Daniel stared at the message. It was a simple question, the kind Marcus asked out of routine rather than curiosity. Normally Daniel would have replied without hesitation. Something short, something safe. But tonight the answer didn't feel simple. He placed the phone on the desk without replying. Instead, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and ran his hands through his hair, trying to organize the thoughts racing through his mind. He had crossed a line. There was no denying that now. For 4 years, Marcus had been the center of Daniel's life. They had built routines, shared responsibilities, and promised each other stability. Even when the emotional distance began growing between them, Daniel had remained loyal. Until today. Yet what troubled him most was not the guilt he expected to feel. It was the clarity. The kiss with Ethan had forced Daniel to confront something he had been avoiding for a long time. His relationship with Marcus had already been fading long before he stepped into that meadow. Daniel finally picked up his phone and typed a response. Yeah, the forest here is really peaceful. Marcus replied a few minutes later. Glad you're enjoying it. I've been busy at work all day. Daniel read the message carefully. There were no follow-up questions, no curiosity about the forest or the trails. Marcus simply assumed Daniel's weekend away was nothing more than a quiet escape. The realization made Daniel's chest tighten. For the first time, He wondered whether Marcus even noticed the growing space between them. Daniel set the phone aside again and leaned back against the wall. The silence in the room felt heavier now, filled with questions he could no longer ignore. Hours passed before sleep finally came. The next morning, Daniel woke early. Sunlight filled the room, brighter than the day before. For a moment he lay still, staring at the ceiling while the events of the previous evening settled back into his thoughts. He knew exactly where he wanted to go. Within an hour, Daniel was once again walking along the familiar forest trail. The path felt almost instinctive now, his feet moving quickly over the dirt as the sound of wind stirred the tall trees around him. When the meadow came into view, Daniel slowed. Ethan stood near the flock of sheep, leaning against the same oak tree where they had first spoken days earlier. The shepherd noticed Daniel almost immediately. There was no surprise in Ethan's expression, only quiet understanding. "You came back," Ethan said as Daniel stepped into the clearing. Daniel nodded, stopping a few feet away. "I needed to talk," he admitted. Ethan pushed away from the tree and walked closer. For a moment neither of them spoke. The sheep wandered calmly behind them, their bells echoing softly across the meadow. Daniel took a steady breath. "What happened yesterday," he began carefully, "I didn't expect it." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "But you didn't regret it either," Ethan said. Daniel hesitated. "No," he admitted honestly. The word hung between them. Ethan studied Daniel's face, as if searching for something deeper than the answer itself. "What about Marcus?" Ethan asked. Daniel looked out across the field before replying. "That's the problem," he said quietly. He explained everything: the quiet apartment, the fading conversations, the sense that he and Marcus had slowly drifted into separate lives without acknowledging it. Ethan listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, the shepherd nodded slowly. "You didn't come to this forest just to escape," Ethan said. "You came here because part of you already knew something had to change." Daniel felt the truth of that statement settle inside him. The forest had simply forced him to face it. "I don't know what happens next," Daniel admitted. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving him space. "That part isn't about me," Ethan replied calmly. "It's about the life you decide to live." The words were simple but carried weight. Daniel understood what Ethan meant. Before anything else could happen, he would have to confront the truth waiting for him back in the city. The silence returned as Daniel looked across the meadow one last time. For days he had believed this forest was a place to hide from his problems. Now he realized it had done the opposite. It had revealed them. Daniel turned slowly toward the trail leading out of the clearing. But before leaving, he glanced back once more at Ethan standing beside the flock of sheep beneath the wide open sky. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel understood that the most difficult part of his story was only just beginning.